Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our institute, IFANS, International Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security, and KNDA. As you know well, this is the 13th IFANS Talks, the session. Our talks is a public lecture as well as interactive dialogue programs. It aims to increase understanding among the general public on the issues of the foreign policy as well as international agenda. Today's program is very unique and very special, as you already noticed, and since we all three speakers are female ambassadors from the diplomatic corps in Seoul, Korea. Ambassador Clare Fearnley of New Zealand and Ambassador Dr. Rohana Ramni of Malaysia, and Ambassador Emma Francois Izumbingabo from Rwanda. You know, the women issue is very important in our international community. Even UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he placed one of the high priority on the gender issues, particularly empowerment of women. So he established one separate independent organizations of UN Women. And then he committed a kind of target to employ more senior UN officers in his secretariat. It's now the percentage of the women, the senior officers in the United Nations, is reaching about 40%. As we see only today, almost more than half audience are female. And the president of the Republic of Korea, my country, my president is female too. It's first time in this region, Northeast Asia. In that sense, we value the importance of the women's contribution and participation today. First speaker, Ambassador Fearnley of New Zealand, will speak on an economically integrated and peaceful Asia Pacific. It's a very comprehensive topic, both the political and economic agenda. The second speaker, Ambassador Dr. Rohana Ramni, she'll tell the story about women in Malaysia. And third speaker, Ambassador Emma Francois, will make a presentation on very specific issue, very well-known issue, the Rwanda issues, 22 years after the 1994 genocide against Tutsi. So each speaker will have about 25 minutes for their presentation, immediately followed by the question and answers. So you raise any question directly to the three speakers. So we'll spend around 30 or 40 minutes for our Q&A session. And we welcome any comment and questions from our audience, students, and also professors, as well as the members of diplomatic corps. So thank you very much for your participation. Without further ado, I'll ask first speaker, Ambassador Fearnley, come forward and make a statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Shin. And just as President Shin was introducing us, it just reminded me we have a very active women ambassadors group here in Seoul. And I'm a relatively recent arrival. I've been here about a year and a half. Some of my colleagues have been here a bit longer, 4 or 5 years. They remember when they arrived that there were only 5 or 6 women ambassadors posted here in Seoul. I'm happy to say I think we've now close to a dozen, 11 or 12 women heading posts here in Seoul. And I'm hoping that the trend will continue. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. That's a greeting in the indigenous language of my country, of Māori. For those of us, whether we're long-term residents in the Asia-Pacific region, or whether we're short-term visitors in the diplomatic community in the region, we all know that we're living in a very dynamic region. It's impossible to be here and not be struck by the dynamism of the region. And of course, it's a region that's come a long way. Just in the last 30 or 40 years, 3 or 4 decades, we've seen millions of people come out of poverty. There's a lot of focus on the China story and the hundreds of millions who've come out of poverty through the reform and opening up of the economy in China. But it's not just a China story, it's across the region. And looking at our present and our immediate future, the Asia-Pacific region has the fastest GDP growth rate of any region in the world, going by ADB, Asia Development Bank reports and statistics. In fact, the projection for 2016, 2017 is that GDP growth rate in the region will probably sit at around 5.7% this year and next year. The 2 largest economies in the region, China and in terms of developing economies, of course Japan as well, but the two largest developing economies, China and India, China is looking at 6.5 to 6.3% growth, India 7.4 to 7.8% growth over this 2-year period, and for ASEAN it's 4.5 to 4.8% growth. Again, very strong, and again the projection is that the growth rates in the region here will be higher than any other region in the world. This projection continues out into the 20s, the 2020s. Again, the predictions for the region are very strong. This is even in the face of some challenges. We've seen over the last 2 years volatility that's been unprecedented in my lifetime and has certainly played out in this region. We've seen China's growth trajectory begin to adjust as China goes through domestic restructuring of its economy, as the cycle slows. We've seen commodity prices drop dramatically and now possibly showing the first signs of possible recovery, but we don't really know whether that's a return to the sort of cyclical commodity prices that we knew in the past, or whether we're seeing a new normal establish itself that'll be different. We have to wait and see. Global factors confronting all regions, a soft global economy, whether it's trade or more broader economic indicators. And on the political security side, as I said, volatility. It's been a remarkable 5 or 6 years where in the global environment, whether you're looking from Arab Spring through to migrant outflows, through to questioning about the identity of the EU and its future, through to the Middle East and Ukraine as well, a vast array of challenges to global stability. Regionally, of course, we're seeing an intensifying jockeying in geostrategic terms. So that comes back into the region as well. But today, I want to talk primarily about regional architecture, picking up on the theme, an economically integrated and peaceful Asia-Pacific. Of course, being situated here on the Korean Peninsula, we know the challenges that South Korea faces. And of course, we can't have a fully peaceful Asia-Pacific region until we have a peaceful Korean Peninsula as well. So I just note that up front. Looking at the Asia-Pacific regional architecture, it's a relatively messy, or messy sounds like a negative, and as you'll hear as I go into my comments, I don't use that word in a critical way. It's untidy in some ways, there are some gaps, and looking at it objectively from the outside, you might say it needs to be tidied up and those gaps need to be filled. But I'd like to discuss that a little bit more in some of the comments I make. I heard recently, and we often hear the contrast drawn between the sorts of frameworks that exist, for example, in Europe, contrasted with the sorts of frameworks that exist in Asia. In Europe, there's a degree of political and economic integration through the European Union, which defines that region. And there's NATO, which is the transatlantic defence underpinning for the security, the transatlantic security arrangements. So that's one approach and one model. In Asia, it's rather different. Europe, of course, is diverse, but I'd argue that Asia is even more diverse. Whether you look at levels of development, the range of levels of development is even greater. The diversity in political systems is greater. We have liberal democracies, and we have states which are run on socialist principles. We have huge variety in terms of historical and cultural backgrounds, different burdens of history that different parts of the region carry. It's a very diverse region. There's no NATO equivalent, to state the obvious, and we've all heard, I think, about the North Asia paradox. I mean, the closest thing to be compared to NATO in a very different way would be the hub and spoke security arrangements between the US and a number of its allies in the Asia-Pacific region. But that, of course, is nothing like the transatlantic collective agreement with NATO. There's a bit more integration on the economic side within the Asia-Pacific, and I want to get onto that in a minute or two. But clearly, it's not surprising that two different regions, Europe and Asia, have taken very different approaches to their regional architecture that they've developed to meet their needs. Looking at the economic side of the regional architecture in the Asia-Pacific, in a way, the private sector is out there ahead of governments. You can see there's been much talk in the last 5 years about global value chains, and you can see the greater integration within the Asia-Pacific through global value chains of the different economies, through increased levels of trade within the region. So to a certain extent, the private sector is out ahead of governments. But over the last 15, 20 years or so, we have seen the development of what people talk about as the noodle bowl of free trade agreements. Taking New Zealand as an example, our first venture into the noodle bowl really was an integration arrangement between New Zealand and Australia. We call it the closer economic relationship, which eliminated all tariffs and integrated our service industries in a way that in some regards is actually more closely integrated even than elements of European Union service industries. So that was a very intense degree of integration. This was in the mid-80s that we established that agreement. Our next experiment in the region was with Singapore. Singapore was our first bilateral free trade agreement other than CER, and we began to negotiate that in the 90s and concluded it around 2000. The example of Singapore for New Zealand is a very interesting one. We have, by my count, four existing concluded free trade agreements in which New Zealand and Singapore both are involved. One's our bilateral agreement. Another is the origins of TPP, the original TPP. We call it P4, but its formal title was the Trans-Pacific Partnership between New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, and Brunei. Then we did another agreement involving ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand. So that's 1, 2, 3. Then we've negotiated TPP together, and of course that hasn't been ratified yet, but it was signed in New Zealand in February, and we're all hoping that it will enter into force smoothly. Certainly New Zealand's ratification process domestically is going smoothly. And then beyond that, we're also looking at the ASEAN-centric RCEP, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So, you know, we have, with an economy like Singapore, we have 5 different frameworks, many similarities across them, and by and large, that complexity of framework, having 5 frameworks that, in theory, our exporters or our investors would need to bear in mind, although it sounds complex, and people say that that's one of the costs of the noodle bowl, complexity and the costs that go with that, actually, our private sector seems to be able to work it out pretty much for themselves under which agreement they'd obtain the most benefit, and then they go with wherever the benefit lies. So that's sort of a different take on the noodle bowl in a way. Korea, of course, also is very active in establishing its own FTA network, and I know that more than 70% of Korea's trade now goes under preferential access through free trade agreements. And I'm very happy to say that last year New Zealand and Korea concluded a free trade agreement, which seems to be working very well for both parties. I have to compliment the Korean negotiators, because from the first 6 months of statistics, Korea exports to New Zealand have gone up by our statistics, have gone up by 24%, which is very positive. New Zealand's exports to Korea have gone up by 15%, which is also very positive, but it does suggest that the Koreans did a very good job. So congratulations to the Korean negotiators. You did a good job in negotiating that FTA. Now, all of this noodle bowl and the greater integration that's been going on, I don't believe would have been possible without some groundwork that was done outside legally binding contexts like free trade agreements. And I look in particular to APEC, where it's been going for more than 25 years. Some people say, is it still needed? Now that we've got these mega FTAs going on across the region, do we still need APEC? But I'd say, yes, we do. It's one of the most effective ways of drawing together both sides of the Northern Pacific. We have the big economies both on the east side of the Pacific and on the west side of the Pacific, drawn together around a trade and investment liberalisation agenda, a TILF agenda as we call it in APEC. It draws together developed and developing economies, the most developed economies in the world, with some economies that are still very much in the developing space. It allows sharing of best practice. It's laid the groundwork for this network, the noodle bowl of bilaterals, plurilaterals and regional agreements to develop. It's not a legally binding environment. You're not negotiating hard treaty text that people will be bound to. It's very much member-driven, it's very much consensual. There's a place for pathfinders where some can go ahead more quickly while others need more time to consider before moving on tricky policy areas. Sometimes there are dramatic results. There was, for example, a great result around tariffs on certain environmental goods and the reduction of tariffs there. But most of the work of APEC, other than the big summits that you see once a year, just concluded recently, the summit in September that was attended by the 21 leaders, other than those dramatic events, much of the work of APEC goes on under the radar. It's not very exciting, but it's about getting our regulators together to ensure that they're sharing information, learning from each other, ensuring that regulations don't get in the way of trade, investment, and closer economic integration. I think APEC in some ways was ahead in this area. APEC's been talking about regulatory coherence and behind-the-border issues before they became a focus. It's 25 years of trying to ensure that if you make a refrigerator in Dunedin in New Zealand, there won't be a regulatory barrier to selling it in downtown Seoul if we chose to, or vice versa. It's about ensuring that as new sectors open up and new regulations are put in place, that whether, for example, electronic vehicles, there's been a lot of work going on as this new regulatory sector is considered by regulators across the 21 economies. How can we ensure that the regulations we're putting in place don't get in the way of greater economic integration across the membership? So that's one an important contribution to the region. Unless all of that work had been happening, I think the bilateral FTA agenda would have been harder to pursue. I think that the mega FTA agenda would have been much harder to pursue. It's really hard to see how TPP, RCEP, or the Free Trade Agreement of the Asia Pacific, the third mega agreement that's out in the distance as a possibility, it's hard to see how they could even be talked about. So turning to those three mega trade agreements, I'll talk first about the ASEAN-centric agreement that's built around the ASEAN 10 countries of Southeast Asia, plus 6 additional economies, including Korea, New Zealand, Japan, China, and Australia, India. So those 6 economies are well into a negotiating process. The hope had been it would be concluded this year. That hasn't proved possible. We're hoping for next year, and real effort is being put into making that possible. Some people choose to describe RCEP as the China alternative to TPP, which is the US alternative. I really don't see it that way. RCEP actually had its origins with Japan and a number of other supporting economies, including New Zealand, who championed an ASEAN plus 6 model for a regional FTA. Some other economies, actually including Korea, favoured more of an ASEAN plus 3 model for negotiating an FTA, considering that it would be more workable. In the end, the plus 6 model worked out in terms of getting the negotiations going in 2012 from memory. I remember in Cambodia at the ASEAN summits there in 2012 that kicked off the RCEP negotiations. It's a different sort of negotiation from TPP. In some ways it's ambitious in its own way, but perhaps not in the same way as TPP, not quite as comprehensive either in terms of subject matter. But, it's something that we think will, be part of that rising tide that lifts all boats in terms of trade liberalisation. So we're an active supporter and actively involved in that negotiation. The other two mega agreements I'd like to refer to are TPP and FTAAP. TPP, as I said earlier, grew out of a much smaller agreement, the original Trans-Pacific Partnership involving New Zealand, Singapore, Chile and Brunei. The US then joined negotiations, and then additional countries continued to join until we got to 11, and then said, for the moment, we just need to cap it until we can try and conclude negotiations. So negotiations concluded last year, the instrument was signed in New Zealand in February, and now each of the 12 members are going through their ratification process. Some of you who follow this issue will see that in the US presidential debate, TPP has become a very contentious issue, and within the two houses, the Senate and the Congress in Washington, a very challenging issue. The rest of us are getting on with ratifying the agreement, and I guess we'll have to see how things play out, but we're hopeful still. We take at face value the words we're hearing from President Obama and Mike Froman, his trade negotiator, that ratification before the end of the year remains possible. We certainly hope that that's the case. So TPP is described as the US option, but in fact it had its origins somewhere else. It had its origins with 4 small countries that wanted to see greater economic integration in the Asia-Pacific. Similarly with the free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific, this is the child that specifically is born from APEC. That's an APEC initiative. Began as a US initiative supported by countries like New Zealand, but more recently has actually been championed by China, certainly during their APEC hosting year. This envisages all 21 economies of APEC being integrated into an FTA. It will be a long haul and it will take time, but in an ideal future where we see both a strong RCEP concluded and a strong TPP concluded, there should be room for something that brings 21 economies together and perhaps others as well. So I'm just going to conclude very quickly on the political side. As already flagged, there's no political security defence equivalent in the region to the sorts of structures we see in Europe, but that simply reflects the reality of the region. Underpinning the defence side for a number of countries is the US hub and spoke approach that's given us Pax Pacifica for much of the latter part of the 20th century. Of course, there were some significant breaches to Pax Pacifica, one here on the Korean Peninsula in the early 50s, and with the ongoing challenges that a divided peninsula present us with. And of course, the Vietnam War, as well as other regional conflicts that have flared up, but perhaps have not been as broad-scaled as either of those two conflicts. In addition to that hub and spoke framework, there's also the ASEAN-centric framework, which Korea and New Zealand, as well as the ASEAN countries, are very active participants in. So we have the ASEAN Regional Forum since 1995, 27 countries, ASEAN plus 6, plus 2, plus more, takes up to 27. It has a security focus, but quite a constrained ability to operate, given the divergent visions for the way the ARF could function. Some countries want to see it much more active and strident in terms of addressing regional problems. Other countries are much more cautious about that, and so that limits what ASEAN can do. But one thing it does do is help us foster that habit of dialogue, that habit of exchange, and much better to be talking than to be resorting to other means of addressing conflict. There's also the East Asia Summit, which is a smaller grouping that's ASEAN plus North Asia, Australia, New Zealand, India, and then more recently Russia and the US joined. So now 18 countries. Again, there are diverse objectives. Perhaps, ASEAN's objectives differ from US objectives, differ from China objectives. So there are constraints on how active ASEAN can be in some areas. It has both an economic and a security mandate, going back to its original terms of reference. And some would criticise it for not doing more in certain areas, but those constraints, again, reflect the realities of the region. We certainly would like to see it doing more, but I think that will be a slow process of evolutionary development. There's also a defence mechanism that mirrors the membership of the EAS called ADMM+, that again is 18 countries. And it really is the first time we've had, it's even slightly newer than the EAS, which is only just over a decade old. But the ADMM+ really is the first time we've had regular get-togethers of the 18 countries of the region. And it helps our defence folk get to know each other, to raise comfort levels to some extent, and to understand each other a little bit better. Of course, in North Asia, there are distinct structures as well. Korea is championing NAPSI in North Asia. It's in North Asia that the North Asian paradox is born, in that we have very little in the way of security structures that tie the three major countries of North Asia together. There are some processes emerging. You see the CJK process, where China, Japan, Korea get together to talk about a range of issues. You also see bilateral versions of that, where Korea gets together with China, or bilateral versions of CJK. You also see another trilateral of Korea, Japan, US, which has become even more active over the last year since the comfort women issue was addressed in late December between Tokyo and Seoul. So there's a lot happening in the region, but it's a region with a lot of history and a lot of historical baggage that makes some issues very difficult to address and progress. So in conclusion, I mean, we have, on the economic side, I keep saying the noodle bowl, but we have a noodle bowl of plenty, where there's even more maybe than we can deal with in terms of different elements, different processes, different FTAs. That's why it's called the noodle bowl. I think on the political security side, though, we have only a partially full bowl. We won't call it a noodle bowl. And on the PolSec side, it's very clear that when really challenging issues like South China Sea or like the Korean Peninsula confront the region, there's only a limited ability of the regional architecture to come to grips with those issues. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, primary action is either with the Security Council and resolutions there, or within what's now a frozen six-party talks process, but it's not happening so much within the regional architecture, other than to flag issues and identify concerns, which is very important to do. Some folks, when they look at the regional architecture, say, we've got to tidy it up, we've got to fill the gaps. But I guess I look at it in a slightly different way. I think things will evolve at their own pace. Of course, we'd like to see them move quickly, but there's only so fast that they can move. A lot of those gaps are there because of the underpinning geostrategic realities, the political realities of the region. That's why those gaps haven't been filled. Some of the messiness, yes, there can be double up, and there can be double up in structures and in processes, but often that gives a degree of security. Sometimes better to have more happening, even if there's overlap, than for an effort that would ultimately be unsuccessful to simplify and streamline. So I'm reasonably patient in terms of pace. I think that despite the challenges that the region is facing at the moment, and we talked about geostrategic jockeying earlier on, I think the trends in the wider region, the trends, for example, within ASEAN, moving toward an ASEAN economic community announced at the end of last year, you can look at some of these things and say, where's the beef? But if you look at the trend is toward greater integration. I'm also an optimist around the interrelationship between economic integration and political security, stability. I know that history has proved me wrong in a number of cases, but it is often the case that where economic integration grows, the ability to manage political security challenges, although it may not keep pace, is actually enhanced through that. So I think with that, I might draw a conclusion and just say thanks for listening to me for the last 25 minutes, and pass on to my colleague, Rohana, who is going to talk about something rather different. So, please.